Another day has just begun. Light strains its way into the apartment, where it finds Kenan in his kitchen, his hand reaching for the plastic jug containing his family's final quarter-liter of water. His movement is slow and stiff, and he seems to himself more an old man than one who will soon celebrate his 40th birthday. His wife, Amila, who is sleeping in the sitting room because it's more secure than their street-facing bedroom, is much the same. Like him, her middle age has somehow escaped her. She's barely 37, but looks well over 50. Her hair is thin and her skin hangs loose off her flesh, suggesting a former woman who, Kenan knows, never was. At least their children are, for now, still children. Like all children, they rail against the limitations placed on them. They want to be grown up, and they wish to be other than they are. But they know what's going on, but they don't entirely understand it. They have learned how to live with it. Perhaps Kenan suspects that's why they don't turn old. It's been over a month since the last time the family had electricity for more than a few hours, and even longer without running water. Both of those things are going to become important in the story. Those are both symbols. While life is more difficult without electricity, it is impossible without water. So, every 4 days, Kenan gathers his collection of plastic containers and travels down the hill, through the old town, across the Miljaka River and up into the hills into the Stari Grad, to the brewery, one of the few places in the city that a person can get clean drinking water. Occasionally, it is possible to find closer sources of water, and he keeps an eye out for them, but they're unreliable and often unsafe. He doesn't want to survive the men on the hills only to be killed by a waterborne parasite, a possibility he considers real and pressing in a city that no longer has a functioning sewage system. The brewery's water comes from underground springs deep in the water table, and he feels this is well worth the risk of the extra distance. As quietly as he can, Kenan picks up the final jug of water and moves down the hall towards the bathroom. His hand flicks on the light switch, a leftover reflex from earlier times. The bulb in the ceiling surges to life. Kenan strikes a match, lights the stub of the candle that sits in the side of the sink below the mirror. He puts the stopper in the drain and pours his quarter-liter of water into the sink. He wets his face, blinks as the cold water registered in his mind as shock. His hands work a small bar of soap just into a lather that he applies to his cheeks, neck, chin, and upper lip. The razor settles into a rhythmic scratch, splash, his pupils narrowing in the light as he observes his progress. When he's done, he wets his face again and dries himself on a crusty towel hanging above the toilet. He blows out the candle and is surprised when the light does not disappear from the room. After a few seconds, he realizes that the electricity is on, that the bulb above his head is glowing, and he almost smiles at his mistake before he understands the significance of it. He's grown accustomed to a world where you will shave by candlelight with soap and cold water. It has become normal. Still, there is electricity, and because that is no longer normal, he rushes out of the bathroom to wake his wife, who will want to get the children up to make the most of it. He imagines a breakfast cooked on the stove and watching the television next to the warmth of the heater. The children's excitement will be catching as they laugh at one of their cartoons. Light will fill all of the rooms and chase away the perpetual dusk that hides in the corners. Even if it doesn't last long, it will make them happy, and for the rest of their day, the faces will be tired from smiling. But as he leaves from the room, he hears a telltale pop, and when he looks back, the light is off. He tries the hall light and confirms what he already knows is true. He returns to the kitchen. There's no longer any reason to wake his family. So the electricity there symbolizes hope, right? He sits at the table and inspects each of the 6 plastic containers he'll take with them. He checks for any obvious cracks that may have been developed since they were last emptied, makes sure that each one has the correct lid. He has 2 backup containers he can substitute if he finds any faults. Deciding how much water you can carry has become something of an art in the city. Carry too little and you'll have to repeat the task more often. Each time you expose yourself to the dangers of the streets, you run the risk of injury or death. But carry too much and you lose the ability to run, duck, and dive. Anything it takes to get out of danger's way. Kenan has decided on 8 canisters, so the 6 from his house will hold about 24 liters of water. 2 more will come from Miss Rostovsky, the elderly neighbor downstairs. As he verifies that his 6 containers are reliable, he hears his wife rise from her bed. She leans into the doorway from the kitchen, rubs sleep from her eyes. It was quiet last night, he says. It won't be too bad out there today. She nods. They both know a quiet night is no way means it will be a quiet day, but Kenan is glad that neither says so. His wife moves across the room and stands in front of him. She places her hand on his head, resting it there before letting it slide down his shoulder, giving his ear a light tug on its way. Be careful. Kenan smiles. It's not so much her words that bring him comfort, but she still says them. She knows as well as he that there's no such thing as careful, that the men on the hills kill anyone, anytime, anywhere they like, and that luck or fate or whatever it is that decides who lives and who does not, has not, in the past, favored those who act in a way that could be described as careful. The odds may punish those who behave recklessly, but everyone else seems about even. Still, there is a time when a person could reasonably act with care for his well-being, and he appreciates that his wife is occasionally willing, for the sake of his sanity, to invoke the memory of those times. He sees her looking at his bottles, tallying them up. Mrs. Rostovsky, yes. She frowns and brushes a strand of hair out of her eyes, then her face softens and she stands back to look at him. He'll need a new coat soon. I'll pick one up when I'm out, he says. Would you like me to get you some shoes? She smiles. Kenan grins back. He's glad that he can still make her smile. No, she says, but I'll take a hat if you have time. Of course, he says. I assume you would like mink? The children are awake now, and she kisses him quick on the cheek before going to check on them. You should go before you see them and lose an hour with your jokes. As the door to the apartment closes behind him, he presses his back to it and slides to the ground. His legs are heavy, his hands cold. He doesn't want to go. What he wants is to go back inside, to crawl into bed and sleep until this war is over. He wants to take his younger daughter to a carnival. He wants to sit up anxious, waiting for his older daughter to return from a movie with a boy he doesn't really like. He wants his son, the middle child, only 10 years old, to think about anything other than how long it will be before he can join the army and fight. Muffled sounds seep out of the apartment, and he worries that one of his children might come to the door. They must not see him like this. They must not know how afraid he is, how useless he is, how powerless he has become. If he doesn't return home today, he doesn't want them to remember him sitting on the landing, shaking like a wet and frightened dog. He pushes himself to the feet and picks up the water containers. He's tied them together by handles of a piece of rope, and although bulky, they're light and easy enough to carry while empty. Later, when they're full, it will be harder, but he'll deal with that then. Kenan knows he's getting progressively weaker, like almost everyone else in the city, and wonders if the day will come when he won't be able to carry back enough water for his family. What then? Will he have to take his son along the trip, as many others do? He doesn't want to do that. If he is killed, he doesn't want anyone in his family to witness it, as much as he would like to see their faces, to be the last thing he sees. And if he and his son were both killed, he knows his wife would never recover. If he thinks about what might happen if his son alone died, he'll be back on the ground. He descends the flight of stairs that leads to the ground floor and knocks on the door to Miss Rostovsky's apartment. Hearing no movement inside, he knocks again with more force. He hears a shuffling and waits for the door to open. Mrs. Rostovsky has lived in this building nearly her whole life, or so she says. Given that she's well into her 70s and it was built shortly after the Second World War, Kenan knows that this can't be true, but he isn't inclined to argue. Mrs. Rostovsky believes what she believes, and no more facts will convince her otherwise. When Kenan and his wife first moved into the apartment building with their older daughter had just been born, Mrs. Rostovsky complained constantly about the child's crying, and as new parents they listened to her criticisms and advice, deferring to the wisdom of someone older and more experienced. After a while, however, they decided that it wasn't the crying that was bothering her. Kenan began to suspect that the baby had become a focal point for all of her discontent. Though annoyed by her repeated intrusions into their lives, Kenan tolerated Mrs. Rostovsky above his wife's objections. There was something about her ferocity that he admired, even if he didn't quite like it. After the war started, Mrs. Rostovsky knocked on their door, and when Kenan opened it, pushed her way past him. His voice was out, but Mrs. Rostovsky didn't appear to notice. She sat on the sofa in front of the room while he made coffee. He put the coffee on a silver tray and placed it on the low table in front of her, but she didn't touch it. Do you have any brandy? She asked, straightening the tray. Of course. He poured each of them a generous measure. Mrs. Rostovsky drained her glass in one swallow. Kenan watched the color rise in her congregated neck and then fade away. Well, she said, this will be the end of me. What will? He asked, thinking she was referring to the brandy. This war. She looked him in the eye, and he did her best not to stare at the large mole on the side of her face and tried to wonder if it was getting bigger. She shook her head. You've never lived through a war. You'll have no idea what it will be like. So this is also very interesting because she has lived through the World War II, right?